Hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I'm your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet, and we are streaming live from the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy podcast studio. And we are super excited to have Dr. Robert Lufkin on our podcast to discuss lies he taught in medical school. Dr. Lufkin, welcome to our show.
Hey, Shawn, it's great to be here. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, my job is I've spent my career. I'm a physician. I'm a practicing physician. After medical school, I joined the faculty at essentially I've spent my whole career in one of two large medical schools here in Southern California, where I became a professor and got to do not only practice medicine, but also as a professor, you get to teach medical students and health professionals, and often as not learn from them as well. And I also got to do get to do research and write papers and textbooks and that kind of thing. So it's been a really fun ride.
Janet, I'll bet you have some questions for Dr. Lufkin.
Well, there's always a journey we have in our career. What prompted you, or what started the thing in your mind to start questioning what you were teaching or what you had learned?
Yeah, that's a great question, Janet. And that gets to the heart of it. I was practicing medicine, being a professor, teaching, minding my own business. Things were going along well, when all of a sudden, I came down with 4 chronic diseases. And these are the chronic diseases that now, occupy up to 80% of our healthcare resources. But when I came down with these diseases, I went to my doctor and they said, here, don't worry about it. We'll give you a prescription. And I got a prescription for each one of the diseases. And they mentioned something about lifestyle. And I said, yeah, what about lifestyle? Does that really work? And they go, nah, it doesn't really work. You're going to be on these pills for the rest of your life, so get used to it. And at that point, my 2 daughters were in elementary school, and I knew enough about medicine and diseases that this wasn't going to end well. And so out of self-interest, I began to question and look to see if there were any other answers out there. And I began a deep dive in the research that had been done in these things. And I realized that a lot had happened, and there were many breakthroughs that had happened that I wasn't aware of, and that many of my colleagues sadly are still not aware of in our understanding of these chronic diseases and what we can do to actually slow them down, and in many cases even reverse them. So long story short, I implemented some changes in my own lifestyle, and in a relatively short amount of time, I went back to my doctors and they couldn't believe it. They thought the machines were broken, the labs were wrong. And anyway, long story short, I got off all medications. My diseases are essentially reversed. And now I've made it my mission in life to help others take back their health and hopefully not make the same mistakes that I've done, that I made.
Well, good for you. And I will say, Dr. Lufkin, it is so reassuring to see physicians like yourself. Janet and I are 2 pharmacists that basically don't believe in drugs to treat most long-term diseases, because most long-term chronic disease is caused by lifestyle, as you know, which we'll get into a little bit later. And if you really want to help people and reverse disease, you have to fix lifestyles and mostly diet, because most, not that exercise and sleep that we preach about all the time are important, but what we put in our bodies is what causes, a lot of our disease. Diabetes is a great example. Type 2 diabetes, it's what we eat. That's what matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm an allopathic physician. I teach at medical schools. I believe in drugs. I believe in pharmacies and everything else where appropriate. And I don't hesitate to prescribe drugs or use them myself even, but for these chronic diseases, it's really a problem. And, you know, my book is really critical of Western medicine. And, you know, some of your audience is probably saying, hey, wait a minute, you're part of the problem. You're the face of Western medicine as a medical school professor. And I have to say, well, you know, Western medicine in the 20th century was truly revolutionary. It was magical. It basically transformed the health of humanity around the world. It elevated all of us, largely through, you know, the pills and surgeries that were developed, but also through public health measures. You know, it just made the world a better place. And even today, if I get hit by a car, I'm going to want Western medicine to, you know, set my bones, blood transfusion, remove my ruptured spleen and all that. But the problem is now, you know, a quarter of the way into the 21st century, we're now facing a tsunami of what I mentioned before are called chronic diseases. And these diseases were present in the 20th century, but nowhere near the numbers now, really literally biblical proportions. And these are the diseases that, you know, you mentioned, going all the way from obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, even mental illness, and that occupy, by some estimates, 80% of our health resources now. That's what we spend all our time with. And the problem is, when Western medicine takes the same pills and surgeries, hey, they were so effective in the 20th century, and applies them to these diseases, these chronic diseases that are so prevalent now, they may work for the acute symptoms, and in many cases they do, but oftentimes they don't get to the underlying root cause, and the diseases continue to progress, even though the symptoms are now masked. And that's really the challenge that we're facing, and what I tried to point out in the book.
I agree with that, because I think, unfortunately, people get a false hope. Hey, I'm taking a blood pressure medication and my blood pressure is lowered, but they haven't changed anything that's causing this underlying problem. And so they kind of have a false hope, I think. Like I'm doing what I need to do, but that's not the case, because just lowering your blood pressure is not going to change your heart disease underlying. You have to do the other things that come along with that, right? I mean, you can't just, I guess we are looking for the magic pill, right? Like the pill for every ill out there, but it's not changing the dynamic of what's happening to our culture without addressing what we do every day.
Absolutely. You hit it right on the head, Janet. And Shawn, as you mentioned, like a great example of that is type 2 diabetes, right? The usual treatment for type 2 diabetes today, which in type 2 diabetes represents 90% or more of diabetes today, and it's epidemic through the population. It's one of these chronic diseases that, you know, some are saying that upwards of half the adult population is on the path to prediabetes or diabetes, and 1/3 of adolescents now are pre-diabetic or diabetic. So this disease is everywhere, and it underlies all these chronic diseases, the insulin resistance, the metabolic dysfunction. But type 2 diabetes, if you're diagnosed with it, the treatment is a combination of pills and injections. You know, it's metformin and other oral medicines, and then eventually insulin. And the insulin is life-saving. If you go into, you know, extremely high blood sugar, you can die of that. So the insulin is literally saving your life. The problem is, if you use these to treat type 2 diabetes for the long term, type 2 diabetes becomes a chronic progressive disease. In other words, what does that mean? Well, it tends to get worse over time. What's the #1 cause of surgical amputations in the United States today? It's type 2 diabetes. What's the #1 cause of renal dialysis or kidney failure? It's type 2 diabetes. What's the #1 cause of retinal blindness? In most patients, type 2 diabetes, and on and on. It's a risk factor for heart disease, cancer. Alzheimer's disease is now referred to in many circles as type 3 diabetes. So by treating it with the standard recommendations of pills and surgery or pills, the disease progresses and gets worse and worse and worse. Even though you don't die of an acute hyperglycemic event, the insulin takes care of that. But on the other hand, there is an option. Type 2 diabetes in most people is caused by carbohydrate toxicity, too much carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, as your audience knows, is one of the 3 macronutrients along with fat and protein, except unlike fat and protein, which are required for life, carbohydrates you really don't need. And there's some human populations that do fine without carbohydrates. So if you're a type 2 diabetic and you remove carbohydrates from your diet, the things that's causing the hyperinsulinemia and all, there are prospective controlled studies that shows that many, if not most, type 2 diabetics can decrease their medications, in many cases get completely off of them. But an interesting thing happens when you treat diabetes with lifestyle, with carbohydrate restriction. It's no longer a chronic progressive disease. For most people, it stops. It doesn't go on to amputation and blindness and renal failure and all these other things. You've essentially arrested the disease. And as you mentioned, Janet, that applies to, to the other things as well, to hypertension and these other chronic diseases, that the medications in many cases don't address the underlying root cause. And that's really the problem.
Well, and I think, we're really good in medicine about, finding a metric, whether it be blood sugar or whether it be blood pressure. And then, finding a drug that can lower that. And I get it. I mean, I think that in some ways that's good, but, we miss the whole point, just basically piggybacking on what Janet says about fixing the problem. And I think that there's studies out there to show that, if you balance your glucose better through medication, you'll decrease mortality and morbidity from a diabetic. If you balance your blood pressure with medication, you'll decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease. But I'm skeptical in some ways. And here's my extreme analogy. So let's just say, Dr. Lufkin, we have a patient that is hypertensive and they have high blood sugar, diabetes, they're type 2 diabetes, and they're 150 pounds overweight. We can normalize their blood sugar and their blood pressure with drugs. But I really, really highly doubt, even if there's studies out there, I really highly doubt that we decrease mortality or morbidity in those patients.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of studies that show that. I referenced some in the book that talk about, and it's an appropriate question. Someone who's struggling with diabetes, they're on insulin, they're wondering, well, if I really tightly control my blood sugar, in other words, keep it down with insulin, how does that affect these chronic things? So if I tightly control the blood sugar and it's really well controlled, have I succeeded in stopping the progression of the disease? And the answer is no. That actually there's certain things that progress even with tight insulin control. There are even some things that get worse. There's instances of hypoglycemia, where you overcorrect and all that, those become a problem as well. But actually the progression of the disease, even with very tight insulin control, doesn't necessarily stop, because we know insulin, it's a hormone, right? And it's life-saving for certain things, but it's also a driver for fat storage. It has many other functions in the body, and high insulin levels drive things like cancer rates. High insulin levels can contribute to Alzheimer's disease through insulin resistance and all. So high insulin is not necessarily a good thing. We want to keep the insulin as low as possible. And the best way to do that is controlling the sugar with diet. So, and even now we're seeing type 1 diabetics who go for controlling their diabetes with lifestyle. In other words, they still require the insulin because their pancreas doesn't produce insulin, but they're able to get by with much lower doses of insulin, which is healthier than high doses of insulin, in my opinion.
Well, and there's, as you know, there's some type 1 diabetics that have been turned into type 2 diabetics because we've given them so much insulin and we give them a pass to say, oh, well, just eat more carbohydrates and use more insulin. That's the answer. So then next thing you know, these type 1 diabetics are type 2 diabetics.
Mm-hmm. Or vice versa, right? Type 2 going to type 1, I think, right? Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. And so too much insulin is not, just raising the insulin dose is not a solution. That's why, people talk about lowering the price of insulin as, something to help the healthcare system. Well, actually, it'd be better if people just use less insulin and control their type 2 diabetes with lifestyle effects, and which they can do.
Yeah, or their type 1 diabetes, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, there's type 1
well.
diabetic. I have a nephew that he uses 11 to 12 units of insulin a day. He's a type 1 diabetic, but he just doesn't eat carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So it's definitely possible.
So why do you think we've reached this point of, do you think it was just by chance because we had these tools of medication to help drive down numbers that we didn't look at lifestyle? Because I'm coming from a very rural background, livestock. If there was something wrong with an animal or you brought your pet into the vet, the first questions are going to be about, lifestyle, like diet, what nutrient might be missing or what. I mean, and I feel like with humans, we've just taken that out of the equation and we've just walked away from it. And we've also said, and you mentioned this earlier, it's not going to change. Like we have no value of, like you were told that your lifestyle changes wouldn't matter, but they did. Like, how did we get to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really gets to the crux of the matter. Well, part of it is the whole medical industrial complex. Medical education is largely funded through the pharmaceutical business. It's funded by the government as well, but pharmaceutical industry pays for a lot of drug studies and influences the approach to disease. That, it's a very drug-centric approach. That's the way, doctors are. There are conscious and unconscious, pernicious financial and other incentives that drive this situation to where, people are prescribed a drug for something rather than giving advice about lifestyle, which would do the same thing. But I have to say that it's, sure, blame the doctors and the medical institution. Fine, I get that. We accept that. But I think part of it is on the patients as well, because I know myself as a patient, I'm basically lazy, right? If I go in with a disease and or a symptom, let's say, and I say, what can you do for me, doctor? And they go, well, we have a pill that'll make it go away. And I go, yeah, sign me up. I'll do that. Because it's just, I take a pill once a day, maybe. That doesn't change my life, doesn't change who I am. Even if they say, you know what, there's no pill for it, but we can do surgery and we'll fix it. And okay, I'll sign up for that too. I might have to take off a week of work, but then I'm back to normal. I don't have to change a thing. So I'm much eager to accept something, all things being equal, to just take a pill or surgery to fix the problem than getting a long lecture about, what I should eat and how I need to exercise more and sleep and lifestyle, because that requires, a mental buy-in, requires me to change literally who I am, even though, it may be for the better. The problem is they're not equal. All things aren't equal. And the pills and the surgery in many, if not most cases, for these chronic metabolic diseases that we're talking about, are a much better solution. The pills and the surgeries are not as good as the lifestyle. The lifestyle is a much better solution, and we should all be embracing the lifestyle because we're all on the path to these these chronic diseases. You know, it's statistically, we all have to die sometime, right? No question, right? But statistically also, the diseases that you and I and most of our listeners will die of is a very short list. It's, you know, it's heart attacks, cancer, Alzheimer's, you know, it's those chronic diseases. So we're all going to get those. But the question is, when do we get them? And I used to think about, as a doctor, I used to think about these diseases as sort of a binary thing, kind of an on and off switch. You know, you either have diabetes, you know, or you don't, you know, and that's the way our health system's set up, right? There's literally blood tests, and you cross a certain threshold with a hemoglobin A1C, which is a blood test for, you know, diabetes. And when it's past a certain point, you now have diabetes. But a week ago, you didn't, you know, because you hadn't crossed that threshold. Well, I don't look at these diseases anymore. I think that's a wrong concept, because we now know that these chronic diseases, literally all of them that we mentioned, they don't begin when the doctor diagnoses them. You know, when I go in, I say, oops, you know, you forgot your keys. Well, guess what? You've got Alzheimer's disease. Or, oh, you know, oh, you now have diabetes. That these diseases literally begin years to decades before the doctor makes the diagnosis. We're seeing that in all of them. Well, what does that mean? It means that if we wait for the doctor to make the diagnosis, we've missed an incredible opportunity for prevention. In other words, people who are out of adolescence, over 18, should start thinking, well, everyone should start thinking about their lifestyle, but really hit it hard once you're, you know, in your 20s, because that's when it starts. And, you know, I have friends, you know, some of them older friends, they go, guess what? I don't have any disease. My doctor says I'm fine. Unlike most Americans who have one of these diseases, if not many of them, you know, they may say, I don't have any diseases. But even those people, if you look at their blood work, their hemoglobin A1C is creeping up, you know, and we know statistically that hemoglobin A1C increases with age in population. So you can even make the argument that many, if not most people, that diabetes is kind of like gray hair. You know, if you live long enough, you will eventually, if you don't die of something else first, you'll probably become insulin resistant and develop type 2 diabetes. But you'll get one of them. Trust me, you're going to die of something. I can guarantee that. So thinking about lifestyle, we shouldn't wait until the doctor diagnoses with something. Lifestyle is something we should all embrace, just for the good of it, because we want to live to see our kids' grandchildren, you know, and all that.
So I don't want to spoil your book, but if you had to say, what's the biggest lie you were taught in medical school, what would you say?
Well, I mean, a big concept that really had changed my way of thinking is that, hey, I'm a doctor, right? Even though I'm a doctor, I now know that doctors don't make me healthy, right? Doctors just make me less sick. If I go to my doctor, they're going to make me less sick. They may give me something, you know, they may fix something, or they may give me something that will help with the symptoms, but they don't necessarily make me healthy. I've come to understand that health is on me as a patient. And it's something that I achieve through the choices I make in the way I live my life, which is called lifestyle. You know, what I eat, when I sleep, when I lift weights, you know, how I look at the world, how I look at the world as far as stress. Is the world a beautiful, loving place full of opportunities and purpose? Or is the world a terrible, frightening place that's out to kill me? And, you know, I have to look around every corner for fear and, you know, this kind of thing. But lifestyle choice, no doctor they can talk to me about lifestyle, but actually doing it is on me as a patient. But every morning I get to wake up and I get to decide how I want to live my life for that day, when I eat, when I exercise, when I sleep, and all those things. So it's kind of an empowering moment that the patient is, as a patient, I'm in charge of my health. The doctor is in charge of my sickness. And hopefully sometimes that may change, but it may not. I think more and more people are realizing that they are in charge of their health, and they're beginning to, check their blood tests at home. They're beginning to, ask questions about supplements. They're beginning to pay attention to their diet and avoiding junk foods and things that will make them less healthy. They're paying attention to their sleep. I think it's a great time in the world where people are more and more starting to look at these things.
I agree. Jen and I have been preaching this for decades, and you've been preaching it for a long time. I think it's all of a sudden cool to preach health and wellness as a healthcare professional, and that's a good thing. So thank you for what you do, which one of our goals of this podcast is to educate and empower individuals to take charge of their own health, and that's basically what you're doing by talking today and writing your book.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love it. I'm not a political person. I love my Republican friends just like I love my Democrat friends. I wish they would get along more, but who would have thought in our lifetime that we would hear on a national level national politicians use the word metabolic health in a sentence, or use the word even seed oils or other things that, in my career, which is a long one, I've never heard this be part of the national political discussion about how we can influence our health by the choices we make. So hopefully it's going to be a continuing conversation, no matter what party is in the White House or whoever is in the majority, but it's really an amazing time.
It is. And I'm skeptical of the government fixing it. But I'm glad they're getting the information. The conversation's coming up. That's really the important part.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's ultimately on us, but when we're surrounded by dangerous junk food that has, harmful weed killer in our grains that is outlawed in most European countries because of the cancer risk, and we have, toxic food dyes and other things in our foods, it's very easy to be unhealthy when we're surrounded by these things. So regulation isn't the solution. I agree with you, but it can help for certain things, that just getting some bad stuff off the plate a little bit.
For sure. So as we wrap this podcast up, what do you have a passion for?
Right now, longevity, actually, I think, and it's a natural sequel to my book, that once we fix our chronic diseases with lifestyle, right, and we live the lifestyle, then we see our lives increasing, the length of our lives, our health span, our lifespan, and so it's a natural segue, and the technology for longevity is proceeding at a dramatic rate, and I think we're all going to see amazing changes in our lives. We're not only going to lead healthier lives, but we're going to be leading much longer lives.
Love to hear that. So we're streaming your book. You can get it on Amazon. Lies I Taught in Medical School with Dr. Robert Lufkin. Tell us, if anybody has any questions, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
My website is robertlufkinmd.com. I'm active on social media. My wife says too active, but you can look for me there and say hi if you want.
Awesome. So we appreciate you being on today. It's such an honor and privilege to talk with you. Hopefully we will get to meet you in person. We didn't get to meet you when you're in San Diego speaking at the World Link Conference, but hopefully one of these days we'll get to meet you.
Thanks, Shawn. Thanks, Janet. It's been a real pleasure.
And listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Tune in Thursday to our midweek podcast, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you.